All right, so thank you for joining us today. We're delighted to welcome Dr. Giulia Andrighetto as part of the CRESS Virtual Collab Productivity During Pandemic Speaker Series. It's quite a mouthful. I'd like us to begin by giving honor and thanks to the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations as the traditional inhabitants of the land where McMaster stands. To say that is to acknowledge a debt to those who were here before us and to recognize our responsibility as guests, to respect and honor the intimate relationship Indigenous peoples have to this land. Dr. Andrighetto is a senior researcher at the Institute of Cognitive Sciences and Technology of the National Research Council in Rome, Italy. And we'll be speaking today about norm emergence and change in a collective risk social dilemma. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Andrighetto, and I'll hand it over to you.
So thanks a lot for your kind introduction, and thanks a lot for the invitation. So I would like to take this an opportunity to present a recent long-term experiment that we have conducted on emergence and change of social norms and on the effect of social norms in promoting cooperation in a social dilemma context. So cooperation is completely central to human social behavior, from friendship to personal relationship, workplace collaboration, to global level issues like conservation and climate change, and also to political participation. What all these situations have in common is that they pose major collective action problems, that are situations in which a group benefits from a certain collective action, that, for example, of overcoming the societal challenge, like, for example, avoiding dangerous climate change, but single individuals have no incentives to act alone. Think, for example, of voting, where if everybody votes, this creates pressure on politicians to do things that are good for people. But any individual vote does not make any difference. And so for a pure individual perspective, why should one be waiting in line for voting? So cooperation is both powerful but also challenging at the same time. And how and why societies solve such social dilemmas and are able to reach cooperation constitutes still a puzzle for the social scientists. And formal institutions like, for example, laws and treaties are certainly important and necessary to address these global issues. However, they are often unavailable or insufficient. And this is when informal institutions like social norms have been shown to be essential. So just let me give you some examples of social norms and the way in which they regulate our everyday life. Social norms have been shown to be important in prescribing people to leave tips in restaurants, even when they are not formally required to do that. They also regulate the way in which we greet each other, but also the way in which we talk each other, but also the way in which we greet each other. By, for example, shaking hands, saying hello, or by kissing 1, 2, 3 times, starting from the right or from the left. And additionally, social norms have been argued, as I mentioned before, to be important also in solving pressing societal challenges of our days, among which declining vaccination, habitat destruction, but also climate change. So social norms are a key concept in the social sciences. They have been often referred to as the grammar, the cement, or the glue of society. So once established, they help us predict each other's behavior and also to coordinate to solve collective action problems. Despite their scientific but also practical importance, the understanding of the factor behind the emergence, change, the dynamics of social norms is still limited, and well-grounded models of how social norms are able to affect human cooperative behavior are still lacking. There are many reasons for that, but one, I think, is that clear definitions of social norms in particular making possible to test empirically the existence and the causal effect of social norms on behavior, have been provided only recently. For example, Cristina Bicchieri, she provided a clear and operational definition of social norms that is also amenable of testing. And this is also the definition of social norm that I'm going to adopt in this work. So this definition sees social norms as informal and shared behavioral rules that, unlike legal norms, are not codified, but are learned through social interaction. Those rules prescribe what individuals ought or are not to do, and they are complied with because of social expectations and potentially social sanction. What is important to stress here is that based on this definition of social norms, people, they don't have individual preferences, unconditional preferences for complying with social norms, but they condition their compliance on the existence of social expectations, normative and empirical, as I will show you in a minute. So social expectations can be broken down into empirical expectations and normative expectations. The first are people's beliefs about what others do or will do, while the latter are beliefs about what others think one ought to do. So put differently, empirical expectations describe the social world, while normative expectations provide the injunctive, the normative component. And on this account, social norms can be said to influence people's behavior if people respond to both empirical and normative expectations, and they can be said to exist if we observe both the behavior and the corresponding expectations. So social norms are not just behavior, are not just expectations, are a combination of the two. And to say to influence the behavior, by people have to respond to both empirical and normative expectations. So the aim of this work is that of understanding the effect of social norms, the causal effect of social norms in influencing human behavior and in promoting human cooperation. And we do this by using evidence from a long-term experiment with human subjects, playing a collective risk social dilemma. I want to say that this work that has been done in collaboration with several colleagues, and I would like to mention Aaron Sekei, Francesca Lipari, Alberto Antonioni, Mario Paolucci, Luca Tumolini, and Ancio Sanchez. And this work is currently under review. So, as I said, the question that we want to address is, do social norms affect the ability of groups to cooperate? This is our research question. And to address it, we have conducted a 30-day experiment. And in particular, 300 subjects have been asked to take their decision outside the lab during 30 consecutive days. So moving from the lab to the field, because this is an online experiment, has allowed us to let norms to form and crystallize in a time span longer than the usual 60-90 minutes, because the experiment lasted 30 days. And then we also had the possibility to ask subjects to take their decisions in situ and not in an abstract environment like the lab, and also to have access to a more diverse population. They were not just students, but also working people and a large variety of subjects. Let me spend a few words about the design of the experiment. So we used a collective risk social dilemma game. So this is an in-person cooperation problem where we had more than 2 people. In particular, we had 6 subjects. So players were placed in groups of 6. Each player was given an endowment of 100 tokens, and they have to independently decide how many tokens to put in a pot from 0 to 100. If the pot reached a certain threshold that in the game has been set to 300, players were protected from a disaster that had a known probability P to occur. and they then keep whatever they did not put in the pot. While if the threshold was not reached, then players lose all tokens with a probability P. So in this specific game, the Nash equilibrium depends on the probability of the disaster to occur. And when the probability is less than 0.5, the only Nash equilibrium is that of contributing 0. While when the probability is equal to 0.5 or higher than 0.5, then also cooperation was a Nash equilibrium. So we had symmetric Nash equilibria to cooperate at the threshold and also to contribute 0. So to be a little bit more concrete, so this is one example. So we have 6 subjects, they all, six players, they all receive an endowment of 100 tokens. They decided how much to put in the collective pot. In this case, in the collective pot was put 310 tokens, and in this case, the catastrophes was avoided because, as you may remember, the threshold had been set at 300. While in this second example, again, we have 6 subjects. They all start with an endowment of 100 tokens. In this case, they decide to put 290 tokens in the collective pot. The probability of the disaster to occur is 0.6. So if the disaster does not occur, then players keep for themselves what they did not put in the collective pot. So the first 4 players, they kept 50 tokens, then the last 2, 40 tokens and 70 tokens respectively. While if the disaster does occur, everyone loses everything. So this is how our experiment, collective risk social dilemma setting worked. So we decided, we implemented 4 treatments, and we had a mixed within and between subjects design. So the within subjects treatment changes the risk probability from 0.9 to 0.6. So our subjects face 1 risk probability for 14 consecutive days. And then after 14 days, there was a change in the risk, moving from 0.9 to 0.6, for example. While the between subjects treatment varies the ordering, whether our subjects face first the low risk and then the high risk, or vice versa. And the within subject treatment allowed us to test if a change in risk from 0.9 to 0.6, for example, had an effect on social norms, and if this effect on social norms then also affected the behavioral change, acted the behavioral change, while the between subjects treatment allow us to test if social norms lead to some spillover effects. These were the 2 aims of our treatments. So we also posited 4 different hypotheses. So first, we anticipated greater cooperation and stronger social norms in the high-risk environment, and slower behavioral change after a change in risk when social norms are stronger. So we anticipated social norms to promote cooperation, but also to make the behavior resistant to change. This was our first hypothesis. The second hypothesis, we predicted that cooperative behavior is related to empirical and normative expectations. Then, our third hypothesis is to test the causal effect of social norms on behavior. So, even if the response to our second hypothesis is positive, it's not sufficient to assess that the behavior is caused by norms. So, empirical and normative expectations can be related to the behavior for many, many reasons. So it's not enough to say that there is an association between empirical and normative expectations to say that there is a causal effect on the behavior. So our more stringent hypothesis also requires that of manipulating empirical and normative expectation to check whether this manipulation causes changes in behavior. This is our third hypothesis. So cooperation changes based on a manipulation in empirical and normative expectations. And our last hypothesis is about punishment. So we expect punishment to be targeted towards norm violators. And we also had an hypothesis on the fact that subjects expect punishment to be targeted towards norm violators. Okay, I will give you some more details about our experimental setting. So, every single day, our players had to take a contribution decision. So this is a screenshot of their of what they see of what they see every day. So how much will you contribute from 0 to 100? And they have to put a number here. So this is the contribution decision. Again, every day we ask our subjects either before or after the decision choice in a random order to answer a question about their personal normative belief. In your opinion, how much should each person in your group contribute? This is a question to have information about their attitudes. It's not about social norms, it's about their personal normative beliefs. Then again, every day, either before or after their decision choice in a random order, we also ask questions about their empirical expectations. And we ask, how much do you think that the other people in your group contribute? All the other 5 players, as you may remember, they were grouped with other 5 subjects, so they were groups of 6. So we ask questions about the other 5 subjects in their group. How much do you think the other people in your group contribute? And the closer the guess, the higher they will be paid for their guesses. So they have also an incentive to make very specific and correct guesses. Those are the empirical expectations. Then we have also the normative expectations. Again, either every day, either before or after their decision, we ask subjects, how much do the other 5 people in your group think that you should contribute? And also in this case, the closer the guess, the higher they will be paid. And in order to know whether their guesses were correct, we match these answers to the questions on the personal normative beliefs that I've shown you before. Any questions? So there was someone, no? Okay. Then in order to assess the causal effect of social norms on behavior, we also manipulated subjects' empirical and normative expectations. So every 3 days, we ask subjects the following hypothetical questions. So, how much will you contribute if most of the other people in your group contribute at least 50 points and think that you should each contribute at least 50 points? This is a scenario in which both empirical and normative, so contribute at least 50 points and think you should each contribute at least 50 points, are both high. Then in the second scenario, we ask the same question, how much will you contribute if most of the other people in your group contribute at least 50 points? Again, empirical expectations are high, and think that should each contribute less than 50 points. So in this case, the normative expectation is low. In the third scenario, we ask how much they are willing to contribute if most of the other people in their group contribute less than 50 points. So the empirical expectations are low. And I think that should each contribute at least 50 points. So in this case, the normative are high. And in the last scenario, both empirical and normative expectations are kept low. Then the very last day, in order not to pollute our results, we ask subjects questions about third-party punishment. So how many points do you deduct from the person you are matched with if he or she contributed less than 50 points, 50 points, and more than 50 points? Again, this is to assess whether punishment is targeted towards non-violators. And also, the last question is about their expectations. So, how many points do you think that others in this experiment deducted from the person they are matched with if he or she contributed less than 50 points, or more than 50 points? Then, every day, we also, so after each round, subjects also received information about the contribution of all the other subjects in their group. Then they also received information if the threshold has been reached or not, if the catastrophe occurred or not, and also their individual payoff for that round. And they were also, but they were only informed about the behavior and the contribution choices of people within their group. Then, the very first day, before starting with the decisions that I've shown you before, we also decided to collect a bunch of data on personality characteristics. So we asked questions to assess a big 5 social value orientation that allows to have information about social preferences of subjects. We also asked questions to assess the risk preferences of our participants, audience spectrum quotient, because all this information allowed us to identify individual level predictors of norm adoption, norm compliance, and norm breaking. So I want also to say that the design, the hypothesis, the analysis have been all pre-registered before starting the experiment and analyzing the data. And you can find everything at this link. So let me now move to the results. Okay, I will start by showing you how risk affects the social norm strength. So the social norm strength is the measure that we have created using 3 different criteria. The first criteria is the agreement between the expectations of the group members. So whether the expectation of the group members were consistent. And this is what we call consistency. The second criteria is whether those expectations correctly predict the behavior. This is what we call accuracy. And the third is the range of acceptable behavior specified by the norm, what we call specificity. And strong norms are highly consistent, highly accurate, and specific. So to create a single norm strength measure, we define norm strength as consistency per accuracy per specificity. This is the way in which we have measured social norm strength. And what I'm showing here is the distribution of norm strength in the 2 stages of the experiment for the 2 different treatments. And in agreement with our hypothesis 1, that stronger norms are to be found when the risk is higher, we find stronger social norms in the high risk settings. And so you can see that in the high to low, so in the left, on the left, we can find, and also in the low to high, so in both cases, in the low part of in the high part of the 2 treatments, the social norm strength is higher compared to the low part of the 2 treatments. And this difference is significant. So the first result is that we found social norms in high risk settings. So high risk has an effect on social norm strength. So let me now move to the contribution levels. What I've shown you before reflects also in the contribution levels that are higher in the high risk scenarios. So there is an effect of risk on social norms and of social norms on contribution levels. And as you may remember, as social norms are stronger and contributions are higher in the high risk settings, we expected cooperation to prevail in the high part of the high to low treatment, but we also expected to slowly break down following a change in risk. So our prediction was that when the social norm is very strong, this makes the behavior more resilient to change. And the second predictions were that we expected that cooperation is less established in the low part of the low to high, but will emerge quickly after the change in risk. And again, consistent with this hypothesis, in round 15, average contribution in low to high is already comparable to the average contribution of subjects in round 14 of the high to low. And this contribution level remains stable until the end of the experiment. In contrast, contribution in the high to low decays slowly when the risk decreases. And this is evidence that stronger social norms make behavior more resistant to change. And so slower behavioral change after a change in risk when social norms are stronger. Let me now move to the test of our second hypothesis. So we now test the association between contribution levels and social expectations. So I'm showing here 4 different models, and all these different models show that there is a strong and positive association between contribution and social expectations. So in the first model is a very simple model with only empirical and normative expectations as predictors. And in that model, we find that there is a positive and strong and positive association between expectations and contribution level. Then in the other 3 models, we also started accounting for some potential confounders, like, for example, past behavior, but also expectations, demographics, psychological controls. And also in these models with full controls, we found that the positive association between expectations and contribution levels holds. And I think it's also interesting here to notice that if we look at the other control variables, the others that are significant are only, maybe it's difficult to see on the right, is other regarding preferences and female are the only 2 control variables that are associated with contribution. For example, risk is not associated, and this is interesting. Risk preferences are not, and is interesting, I think, given the nature of the design that involves risk. So let me now move to our third hypothesis. So we found an association between social expectations and behavior. And now we want to test whether this is just an association or there is some causality. And to test causality, the causal effect on cooperation, what we did is to look if a manipulation in expectations, that expectations, as you may remember, we have identified as the key elements that characterize social norms, result in a change in the cooperative behavior. So we wanted to check whether by manipulating the expectations, empirical and normative, we observe a change in behavior. And this is a test of the causal effect of social expectations on behavior. So as you may see here, when compared to when both empirical and normative expectations are low, if we increase empirical expectations, for example, and we kept the normative expectations low, we'll find an increase in contribution. When the empirical expectations are kept low and are the normative expectations to become high, the third column, we can see that there is even a higher increase in cooperation. And as expected, when both are high, this is what leads to the higher increase in cooperation. And I want to stress that I think is interesting because, okay, subjects increase their contribution in response to both empirical and normative expectations. And I think it's particularly interesting because it shows that people care about a belief, the normative expectation, that has no material implication for them. Because while the empirical expectation can provide subjects some hints on how to coordinate and reach the threshold, the normative information has no material implication for them. Let me now move to a summary of the results. So what we have found is that risk has an effect on social norms and coordinates social expectations and contributions, leading to higher cooperation under high risk. And then the second, so there is an effect of risk on social norms and an effect of social norms on contribution. Then the second result is that stronger norms provide greater resistance to behavioral change than loose ones. Those are the two key results of our experiment. Let me now move to the conclusions. These results may help increasing cooperation in collective risk social dilemmas. For example, when proposing policy interventions, it is important to account for the existence of social norms present in the societies in which they have to be applied. As you may remember, our results also show that when the threat decreases, the norm strength diminishes. Again, I think this is an issue to keep in mind when designing policy interventions. So once the social dilemma has been, for example, provisionally adverted, it's essential to establish mechanisms to enforce compliance with evolved social norms in order to sustain cooperation further in time. Otherwise, the behavior obtained once the risk decreases changes. So it's important to maintain the social norms high. And I think a third important result is that social factors are more effective in promoting cooperative behavior than personal dispositions. So this suggests that it may not be necessary to shape individuals' dispositions in order to change behavior, and shaping expectation that is often easier can be sufficient. So I think this is a third important result, also with important implications. And I would like to thank all the co-authors and collaborators for this work, and also thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Andrighetto. If there are any questions at this time, let's give us a bigger screen here. There we go. All right. If we have any questions at this time, and if you don't mind, Dr. Andrighetto, I would like to go ask a question. As I'm a very new social work student, so I'm very interested in the human dynamic as we have it. And I had two questions actually, and depending on your reaction to the first, you may laugh me out of this one. I may not get to the second one. So I was very curious about, you started with your social norms and how important they are. I'm very curious how the pandemic has affected what we consider normal social norms now, and how you see that will affect, the characteristics of our social norms in the future. I mean, certainly from the physical interactions that will have, a huge change. And have we seen it with an immediacy, and do we see where the future of that will go?
Thanks a lot for this question. So I think it's a very important question. So there is an important theory, an ecological theory of culture, and a leading scholar is Michel Gelfand, proposing that social norms change after threats, ecological threats or social threats. So in those contexts that have faced during their evolution, their history, strong threats, they have evolved stronger norms. So stronger norms that are important to coordinate people's behavior and allowing people to overcome collective action problems of different types. For example, that of overcoming a pandemic. I think it's a very interesting theory. She also has provided support, but she didn't provide support for this causal effect of the threat on the, let's say, strength of social norms. And at the beginning of the pandemic, we decided to test for these. So we have now, we collected data on these that we are now analyzing to test the effect of a pandemic, an ecological threat, on the strength of norms. So I expect this effect to occur. So I expect social norms to become stronger after a pandemic. We still need to test it causally, so I cannot have a final answer now, but I really expect social norms to change. I don't know how for how long this effect will last. Again, this is, I think, a very important point to be tested, but my prediction is that there is a change in the strength of social norms. And of course, this is important because it helps people to overcome collective action problems during an emergency like the one that we are facing now.
Right.
So I think this is a really important time in which to observe and study the change in social norms, exactly because of this big threat that we faced collectively.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much for answering that. We have a question from Kristen. What impact do you think it might have if you added additional variables related to inequity, i.e. participants would be given different amounts rather than all the same amount to potentially contribute?
Very, very good point. So it depends, I think, whether this is a private information or public information. So if they know that there is heterogeneity in their endowments, then I expect different types of norms to emerge. Here the norm was that of contributing 50. I expect different types of norms to emerge. This is again something that I think is worth testing empirically. So I don't have an answer now, but I expect different types of norms to emerge depending on the type of information they have about their own endowment and the endowment of others. Our case was a simple case in which they all received the same amount of money. So they also expected others to contribute the same to reach the threshold. But if the endowment changes, their expectations would also change accordingly.
Alison Van has a question for you.
Hi, thank you so much. I've been struck in thinking about this, and I think it's partly because of my own background as an applied policy researcher that I instantly think about how do you take the implications from this and begin to operationalize it in approaching these massive public policy challenges in front of us through a norms context. And I was struck by the tremendous impact that occurred in the state when the Heath brothers wrote Nudge and started to really introduce into the popular imagination the idea that you could have significant behavioral impacts with relatively simple interventions. So I was wondering if you had some examples of kind of elegant means of being able to introduce and then enforce the stickiness of norms in order to encourage cooperation on larger social issues.
Well, thanks a lot again for this question. I think it's highly relevant. So I think that there are several examples in which this can be applied also and had been applied for obtaining behavioral change. One example is that, for example, of binge drinking the colleges. So there was this, this was a big issue. And there were many studies showing that students, they thought that others were drinking more, much more than they were really drinking. So this is what is typically called pluralistic ignorance. So it's the behavior that is based on false beliefs. So I believe that others are drinking a lot. I believe that others want me to drink a lot. So there is the false empirical and normative expectations. And what they have shown is that by giving students the real distribution of, so the real information about the behavior of others and also the normative expectation of others, this has an effect in alleviating the problem of binge drinking, because then students change their behavior because they don't feel this social pressure anymore. So this is just one out of many examples of how this type, I think, of theory can be applied to solve some practical issues.
Thank you.
Perfect. All right. So if there are any other questions in the chat, please go ahead and submit those. Otherwise, I'm going to dominate Dr. Andrighetto's time with my second question, if you don't mind. So I'm curious. One of the things I always tell my daughter is do good even if nobody's watching. Just do it for the sake of being good. So I'm curious, in your group experiment, where they were asked to admit how much they had submitted into the pot, how much did they think somebody else was going to submit into the pot. I'm curious if those questions had never been answered, and there was no accountability for admitting how much they were going to submit to the pot for the disaster. Do you think that the contribution to that would be different, given the fact there was no accountability for them? It's still good to make the best decision for the greater good if you are not monitored or praised for your choices?
Excellent. So in this specific experiment, since they were rematched with the different people every single day, every round, it's like saying that there is no possibility for others to know what you did. So it's like a non-observability condition, what we implemented. So I think that the amount of contribution that we observe here, it's lower than if we had run the same experiment with what we call partner matching. So by keeping the group the same from the beginning to the end of the experiment, in which you can also build some reputational concern. Mm-hmm. So in this specific setting, you receive information about what others did. You cannot link this information to the identity. So it's really anonymous. It's not really anonymous, but we try to keep anonymity high. I can say, and this is, I think, something that should be tested empirically, that observability, so when you are observed, this increases social non-compliance. And something that we would like to test is to check whether typically one explanation is social image concern, because you have some concern about your social image, right? It's like you care about reputation. I think that there is also another explanation. You care about the expectation of others. So if others expect you to behave in a certain way and you know that, you don't want to let others' expectations down. And this has been also conceptualized in terms of guilt, but also in terms of normative expectations. So you feel some normative pressure. So if you know that others are observing you, then you care about what others want you to do, even though they cannot punish you in any way. And this is something that we would like to test. But again, I think that and when you are observed, so it has been shown that when you are observed, non-compliance increases. It's still not clear what are the underlying mechanisms, apart from social image concerns, whether there are other mechanisms. But it's worth testing it, and I think so it's an important point.
Perfect. Thank you so much. There are no other questions. So if there are no other questions from our audience, I think we are at an end of our discussion for this morning.